Hello and welcome to this episode of the Star Wars Universe Podcast. My friends, Mandalorian is done, Bad Batch is done, and Star Wars fans across the galaxies are asking, what next? We have a lot of new content coming. You probably heard an episode we recently released about all the things coming at Celebration. And for those of you who are not the most, I have watched everything and read every comic and read every book and read the back of every single action figure and video game that's ever been out there, some people have questions about, well, what do I need to know about what's coming next? And what are the stories and how does it all connect and things like that? Myself and Pete Wright, who is one of the founders of the True Story FM podcast network that this and my Superhero Ethics podcast are becoming a part of. So this is kind of a fun way to inaugurate that. Has some questions for me, and we're going to discuss them right here on this podcast, along with some listener questions that are coming in because, and this is some pretty big news, one of the things that happens on True Story FM is that a lot of the things get live streamed. So there is a strong possibility that we're going back to live streaming these episodes. That might be for patrons, members only. We're not sure yet. A lot of things still to figure out. That is not one of the questions we will be exploring, but today we will be exploring what's happening in the Star Wars universe. Why do I only have a 3-pack if I worked out a lot? And is Pete a direct descendant of the people who taught us how to fly? All that and more after commercial break we have no control over.
Outstanding.
Welcome back. This is Matthew Fox, your host, they, them pronouns. As I said, I'm joined by Pete Wright. Pete, you're a man of so many titles and so many accomplishments, most of which I don't remember. I mean, just don't have the ability to run off myself. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
There's actually precious little to say. I'm one of the founders of True Story FM. Started podcasting back in 2006, so I've been doing this a very, very long time. Many, many shows. Most of the shows that I do are in somehow related to film and pop culture. And our longest running show is the Next Reel Film Podcast, which we've been talking about consistently week over week over week about movies and how they connect with people. With my co-host and partner Andy Nelson. He is my partner at True Story FM, and we kind of run the show together. So eager to talk about Star Wars today.
Awesome. Now, for anybody who does recognize Pete's voice in connection to myself, one of the podcasts that they run is the Marvel Movie Minute, which myself, along with a lot of other people who have been on this podcast and the Stranded Panda podcast, such as Matt Carroll, Ashley Coffin, Paul Hoppy, Will Freeland, have all been guests on.
Yes.
So, and that's where I first connected with Pete, and I'm really excited to have you on. So, Pete, why don't you just talk a little bit about where you kind of are as a Star Wars fan now, in terms of what's the stuff that you've been following, what's the stuff you haven't been following, all that kind of thing. Because we're going to kind of use you as the audience surrogate today in terms of like, let's get caught up.
So I'm a man of a certain age, and so my first significant cinematic experience was episode 4, A New Hope, with my Uncle Tim.
Yep.
Shout out to Uncle Tim. I don't think my parents would have taken me to the movie, but Tim was a younger man at the time and had no qualms about introducing a man of my age to Star Wars. And it has been central to kind of my vision of what science fiction fantasy could be since I was very, very young. I am a huge fan of most of the movies, and frankly, I've aged into 2 of the 3 prequels. I just can't watch the first one. I cannot stand midichlorians to the point that it makes me shake and my skin starts to tingle. Like, I feel like that is a ridiculous bastardization of what Star Wars was to me. So don't want to yuck anybody's yum. If you're a big midichlorian head, that's fine. But the sooner we could move away from midichlorians, the better. The other 2, the political intrigue, the machinations of the Empire in the second 2 prequels, and even the sort of reboots, like even the J.J. Abrams, I can find stuff to love about all 3 of the movies that come after the principal 4, 5, and 6. Even though I feel like as a trio they are chaotic and disconnected in many ways, I find a lot that I can still connect to and love. love. And I have two of my dear childhood friends they won the Force for Change contest and were in the Force Awakens in the scene in the gambling hall where we, they're in the background. They got all the makeup. They got to go to London and hang out with J.J. Abrams and crew. And so, there's just a lot of fun. So that's my movie experience. At the end of the movies, I'm so done with Skywalker. Like, I'm done with the Skywalker saga. I really am finished with that. And here we are in what have to be the halcyon days of Star Wars with Disney Plus and what they're doing on the small screen, because I find this stuff to be absolutely fascinating. And widely, I think people like it, but I am eager for the point that Star Wars transcends the Skywalker saga more completely, more thoroughly, and this Star Wars embraces the broad new galaxy. So that's kind of where we are. And I just finished, last night, season 2 of The Bad Batch for our conversation here. Oh my God. Huge fan of Andor, one of my favorite things that Star Wars has ever done. And of course, Mandalorian season 3. Pedro Pascal can read me bedtime stories. So.
I have to say, there was a point in time where for a couple of weeks, Mandalorian was coming out at the same time that The Last of Us was coming out. And I think just if there was any doubt that Pedro Pascal is the one to adopt a wayward child and take them to their destiny, it is clearly like...
Well, and then they did the SNL. He did the SNL spoof for it. Did you see him standing up?
Yes, Mario Kart. I want to see that. The HBO dark version of Mario Kart. I want to see it.
That whole episode was fantastic. But when they do the high school where they say, that he's daddy, I just died. Like, that was so good that he has. I watched him on it's a British talk show he was on, and he was asked, like, why, what do you think of all this? And he's just like, I really don't know. I really legitimately don't know how this has happened to me and why people are saying the things they do about me, but which is the best kind of fandom.
I don't know if the TV folks will do this, but the possibility that he might be nominated for 3 different Emmys in the same year for Last of Us, I think, is the one where he would most clearly deserve it. Mando, I think, is a possibility, but also for Best Actor in a comedy, like a single episode comedy sketch show, is also a category. So he could win for that. Well, I'm so glad to hear more of that background, and you and I actually are grounded in very similar ways. I am not quite of your same age, but very similar in that for me, my first movie experience that I remember was Return of the Jedi, only a couple of years later. My mother likes to say that it is her responsibility that I was a Star Wars fan to begin with, because according to some politically, New Hope is the first movie I ever saw because she was about 6 months pregnant when she went in to see A New Hope. I will skirt those political conversations. I think most people know I'm fairly on the left. But the point is, yes, that I've grown up with those movies. With both A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, I literally don't remember a time when I hadn't seen them. But my first cinematographic memory is sitting in a theater feeling literally pushed back into my seat by the crash of noise when the opening scroll to Return of the Jedi begins. I will also say this will probably come out after this happens, but the day we're recording this, in just a few days, Pete, I'm sure you know about this, but anyone who's listening on YouTube, Return of the Jedi is coming back to theaters for the 40th anniversary. I have my tickets. I'm really excited to go have that experience again. It probably won't be quite as loud to 45-year-old me as it was to 6-year-old me or 5-year-old me. But I'm definitely looking forward to that. The other thing that I'll say is... And just to give you the little plug, over on, I think it was on True Story. Here's why I do like to edit these things. I believe it was on the Next Reel podcast. You and Andy actually did review. You guys found copies of the original theatrical 1970s, 1980s releases of the original trilogy movies and did reviews of them. And I had them on Betamax, which I think is kind of version like 2.0, and then like we're now on like version 6.0 with all the things. But it's great to listen to you two as fans who grew up with these movies, but also talking about those original cuts. fans.
Well, I appreciate that, and I would just augment a little bit. What we found was specifically the Harmy despecialized version, which is a really special fan edit by people who know how to make movies and do special effects, and they took every single version of that has ever been released of each of these movies, and they incorporated anywhere the effects had been upgraded from the original movie, they incorporated it back into the original movie. So blasters, explosions, those kinds of things are in there. But Han shoots first. There's no additional tour of Mos Eisley. Like all of the stuff that wasn't in the original theatrical cut, they did not add back. So they really just remastered, upgraded what we got in the original movie, and remastered the sound. And it's extraordinary. And you can get it. Just search for Harmy Despecialized. You can download it. It's on, like, they'll give you a BitTorrent link, and you can download all three of them. And they're extraordinary. They're extraordinary. Like, it's just, I get excited just talking about it. The fact that these things exist is a huge gift.
That's awesome. I'm glad you corrected me, because I will say there's a certain part of me that has very fond memories of the TIE fighters in the first Death Star attack run jerking around the screen, as you can pretty clearly see the person holding it. And I miss that, and so knowing I wouldn't see that, like,
they
that
did clean up the matte lines for sure. You know, they cleaned up all of those things. But I'll tell you, in Return of the Jedi, you know the scene I'm talking about, the flight into the Death Star, where all the TIEs come out, and that fractal is extraordinary. It's just beautiful in this version. It's the best.
And they give me back my Yub Nub. Yeah, they give me back my Yub Nub. Right. That's what I care about. Okay. It is as it was. It is as it was. Awesome. Although I am I'm in the boat. I like that final song. I like the updated song. That's fair. That's fair. Maybe it's because I was a little bit younger than you were when I first saw Yub Nub, but that is, to me.
I mean, I could still sing it. Like, I still know all the words, but.
I hear you. Well, anyway, so let's talk more about this actual topic we're bringing up, and just to give me a little bit more of your background. So you have seen the kind of Disney-era Star Wars television. Have you seen any of the Clone Wars or Star Wars Rebels or any of those shows?
Yes, and so I've done them all. With Clone Wars and Rebels, I think both suffer the same challenges in their first season. I am one of those people that believes that the first seasons of both of those shows were a bit of a slog, and particularly in the boat of Rebels, felt like my first Star Wars, right? It was like, it felt like the animation style, everything had changed to something that was so effectively just youthful and childlike, which is great and exuberant, and I love that it existed like that. But it wasn't really grabbing me, so I took a long break in Rebels and watched that first season and then kind of put it away. I came back to it very recently and just binged the rest of it, and it did the same thing that Clone Wars did. It leads up to its very best season and its most mature storylines in the last sort of 2 seasons of it. Clone Wars, Season 7 of Clone Wars is the most extraordinary Star Wars that there has been. It is just incredible storytelling, and brings us into sort of the reality of these characters that feels like, even though I'm watching an animated show, it feels like these people are as alive and well as I could ever have experienced them, like I could reach out and touch them. It was really wonderful. I think the Favreau-Filoni era of Star Wars is extraordinary. I think they're at just peak storytelling, and I'm really thrilled with it. So, big fan. And this is where I am so curious for you to kind of pull out the crystal ball, because where things line up, where we have Clone Wars, young Ahsoka becoming adult Ahsoka in the upcoming live series, we have young Ezra Bridger maturing into adulthood and disappearing at the end of Bad Batch, and they're in the same sort of timeline. And of course, we have, we've got, where do they line up with, all the upcoming other properties and Thrawn and all of those things. So my head is exploding.
Well, and let me first just say here, so we will be spoiling everything that has happened in both the Clone Wars TV show and in Rebels TV show. And hopefully, if you're listening to this, either you've seen those or you're okay being spoiled on them. Or perhaps even you've just listened to all of our coverage of those things.
You've been spoiled if you've been listening to this show, for sure.
As has been pointed out, the last episode of our Clone Wars coverage has gone missing. Somewhere the gods of podcasts have eaten that episode. So myself and a few others will be re-recording on the final arc of the Clone Wars. That should go up sometime in the next month or two. Also, big news, it looks like we are going to be able to finish our Rebels coverage because we had to stop around season 3 because so much new stuff came out. But we will be going back to doing episode-by-episode coverage of Rebels to finish that before Ahsoka. So if you don't want to be spoiled on that, if you want to hit pause now and come back, that's totally fair. But we will be kind of talking about all those things.
Well,
but trust me, even if you hear us spoil it, there's still so much more to see that I promise is worthwhile.
Well, and I feel like I feel like that part, the final season of Clone Wars, but absolutely, that's Gods of Podcasts speak up, right? Why? How did that go missing?
Yeah.
I'm glad you're going to Taylor Swift that and do an updated version of it. But if anything deserves an episode by episode coverage, it's that last season of the Bad Batch. I think it was really, really good. And those characters, no, of the Bad. Didn't you say you're going to do episode by episode of the Bad Batch?
Oh, we did do that. That we have.
Oh,
done.
you have done that. Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So you're doing the Clone Wars episode by episode.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, so let me. The Clone Wars on the Ethical Panda website, and now I believe by the time you listen to us, also the True Story FM website, you will find we have done episode. Well, we often would do like 2 or 3 episodes at a time, just because I think the Clone Wars the Clone Wars just has a lot of incredibly good episodes and a lot of filler. I think the word filler gets used far too often these days, but I think it does fit for the Clone Wars. We did coverage of that, including the final season. We really did literally episode by episode because they were so good. Our coverage of the last episode of the Clone Wars season 7 has gone missing somehow. So we're going to re-record on the last arc, which is the last 4 episodes, The Siege of Mandalore, which, as I will talk about,
is important.
Ties in quite a lot to the events of Mandalorian season 7.
Yes.
Season 2. Season 3. Wow. We have also done episode by episode, or at times arc by arc coverage of Rebels, which we had to stop, I believe, 2/3 of the way through season 3 because so many new shows kept coming up, and then other things happened with family and sickness and things like that. So that's what we'll be recontinuing.
Okay.
So, with all that, let me actually first ask you this question, because I think here's the parallel that I'm seeing, because I agree with you that I'm fairly done with the Skywalker saga. Rey is a Skywalker. For me, I'm perfectly fine about that, although I don't like a lot of the things that happen to her character in Rise of Skywalker, but that's another story entirely. But I'm very much done with her character. And there's a part of me that is looking forward to, and I'm not done with her character, I'm very much done with the Skywalkers. And one of the things that I'm definitely looking forward to some stories that are set in a completely different era without any of these characters being mentioned, and we're going to be getting that. The other thing, though, that I'm finding is that like you, I did not grow up with the prequels. I'm sure that our parents and people of that generation rolled their eyes at a lot of things in the original movies that we loved. In the same way, I think I found a lot of the prequels kind of hard to watch because I wasn't watching them as a younger person, and maybe I was devoid of all joy. You can yell at me at that. But I found that the Clone Wars really filled in some of the gaps and made some of the things in the prequels make a lot more sense. And when I've gone back and watched the prequels since then, they make a lot more sense. One of the things I think that made the sequels hard for some people is that we all of a sudden had, oh yeah, the New Republic is falling apart, and Luke is angry and bitter, and all this stuff that wasn't ever really explained to us. And what I've been finding, I think it's something we'll be talking about, but I'm curious if you're getting this feeling just from what you've seen, that Bad Batch and Mandalorian are both kind of helping to fill in some of the gaps of how do we get to a place where the New Republic is so weak that all these people are joining the First Order and that the New Republic won't even fight the First Order. Like, are you finding that those shows are helping to fill in some of the gaps and make the sequels make more sense for you?
Well, I think so. And I think that is a central question, right? Is that because
Right.
where power is lost is on the fringes, and that's why this sort of space western Mandalorian, and it's why dealing with the story of Mandalore at the edges of power, it does, I think, set us up for the making the connection to the First Order rising to power, right? That there is there is going to be a void, some void that has to be filled politically, militarily, and culturally. And I think that's what we need. That's what we need to get to. I feel like the workaday adventures that were going on, visiting Mandalore after its ultimate sort of destruction, quote destruction, it's all fine. But the larger story is we're looking at where the void is being created right now, and we're looking at the fringes reclaiming power, and that does nothing but help making the transition to the First Order.
Yeah, definitely. So let's get into that, and let's start with the story of Ahsoka, because I think that's one of the ones that is the most interesting to people, especially folks who haven't necessarily caught up with all the stuff. So let me kind of give a brief summary of the different parts of Ahsoka's story, and then we can ask kind of questions and talk about that, and then move on to the next thing, but to help set up her show. So Ahsoka is introduced to us in the TV show The Clone Wars. I think actually in the movie The Clone Wars, where not only is Anakin now a Jedi Knight instead of just being a Padawan, but he is supposed to take on a Padawan of his own. And the original idea for her character was George Lucas wanted The Clone Wars was definitely aimed at a much younger audience, the movie especially, but even so the show originally. But I think my colleague Paul pointed out that to some extent the show grows because the audience of the show is growing.
100%.
But also I think because George Lucas took his hands off and Filoni was able to be like, no, let's do some real storytelling here. But so Ahsoka then becomes a very fundamental part of us learning about what the Jedi were like and us seeing other sides of Anakin. And because one of the things you get to see is that in the show, I think it really helps to fill in some of the gaps about Anakin and who he was and why he fell, and that a lot of the reason why he fell was because he had compassion. He had attachment. He had all of these feelings for the clones that a lot of the other Jedis knew they weren't supposed to have. And that I'm greatly simplifying things there. I just got a whole bunch of angry emails just by that one sentence. Hopefully you know what I mean there. It's not that they don't have feelings, but that they were better able. He was the one who would say, I am going to risk everything to rescue my droid, or to rescue my Padme, or to rescue my Padawan. Mm-hmm. And so Ahsoka is put in this fascinating position for most of the show in which she is both being taught by Anakin, but also being taught by the whole rest of the Jedi. And so she's often the one who's sort of being like, Master, referring to Anakin, like, I think you're going too far. And that she sometimes sides with him and sometimes doesn't. Right. She is very close to Anakin. She, I think it is pretty clearly implied, knows about Anakin and Padme, or at least has some big suspicions about the two of them. And in one of the most important arcs for her, in season 5, I believe, in one of the other arcs, there's another Jedi Padawan who winds up setting off a bomb in the Jedi Temple and doing some other harmful things. And it's because she's one of the ones who sees she sees that the Jedi are becoming corrupted, that they are falling to the dark side, and that Palpatine is pulling all the strings and all the hypocrisy and wrongness of it all. It's a whole beautiful story arc of its own that's definitely worth checking out, or check out our episodes about it on Star Wars Universe Podcast. But the point is that as a part of that process, Ahsoka gets wrongly accused. And because of the intricacies of the political system in which the Jedi are not allowed to investigate themselves, the only way she can stand in a civilian court is if they kick her out of the Jedi. And that is also another one of the most fascinating arcs in the show and most ethically complex, because on the one hand, you're like, why the Jedi are so good? Why can't they take care of this? And then you think about the Jedi are the law enforcement of their time and place. How do we feel about law enforcement in investigating their own and civilian oversight or the military, if you want to see there was military, not law enforcement. Anyway, point is, she gets kicked out of the Jedi. And by the end of those episodes, she has seen that they have seen that it wasn't her. Anakin begs her to come back, but she still says, no, I can't come back. I can't. I've seen too much. At this point, we get a couple of different versions of what happens to her story next. Tales of the Jedi tells a version of her story. The novel Ahsoka also tells a version of her story. The novel by I believe it's by E.K. Johnson. They mostly overlap, although the Tales of the Jedi changes some details from the book, which I should say is an interesting overall thing as part of this. Unlike things like MCU and the like, Disney is saying that the books that are coming out right now are 100% canon.
Any new books?
Any new books that are coming out are 100% canon. Old books are being mined for some of their story details. We'll get to that in a second. But also then you have a problem of, in terms of barrier of entry, the number of people who see things on screen versus the number of people who read them is always going to be vastly different. So Tales of the Jedi does change some details of her story. Most importantly, it erases a queer character that a lot of people really loved, and so there's definitely some hullabaloo about that I understand why people are concerned and join them. But the main point is she defeats a Sith Inquisitor, one of the people who at this point is wait, hold on, I'm sorry. Give me 2 seconds to remember all the details here. No, yeah, okay. I'm going to back all this up. I'm wrong. Here's why there's so much to take in, and I'm going to try not to give you everything. And please, Pete, jump in with questions, because I'm wrong. The next time we see her, then we get some snippets of her story, and that she's kind of off on her own, and she winds up, she becomes kind of like an A-team. She's on the run, but when she finds people in need, she's going to help them.
Yeah. This is still in Clone Wars that we're talking about here.
This is still in the Clone Wars era, yes. So before the events of the third movie, Revenge of the Sith. And then eventually she gets to a place where Bo-Katan and the people who are on Mandalore have a problem in that Darth Maul has taken over Mandalore. And these are the events of the 7th season of Clone Wars. I'm not going to give a full summary by any means, but she, through various circumstances, both Ahsoka and Obi-Wan and Anakin have all been asked to go help rescue Mandalore from Darth Maul. During the course of their journey to Mandalore, Obi-Wan and Anakin get the news of the Chancellor has just been kidnapped. You need to come back to Coruscant as soon as possible to help deal with this. We then get into the question of why does space travel... Space travel goes at the speed of plot throughout Star Wars. It's one of the biggest problems in the universe.
The speed of plot is very fast, Matthew. It's very fast.
It's very fast when it needs to be, but it's also sometimes very slow.
Yes.
It's exactly the speed it needs to be for the plot.
Yes, it parsecs.
Yeah.
Also.
But the point of this all being, this is why Ahsoka is not with Anakin when he falls to the dark side, and you get to see her kind of understanding in the Force that some tragedy has happened, that she suspects something has happened. She gets to be a part of defeating Darth Maul. And I'm trying hard not to give the moment-by-moment recap of all that, but I'll just say, in terms of the growth of the Clone Wars TV show, Season 1, as you pointed out, the animation is pretty standard, pretty weak. It looks like basic video game animation. By Episode 7, there's a lightsaber duel between Ahsoka and Darth Maul, where they actually brought back Ray Park, the person who did all the stunts and who played Darth Maul originally, brought in another amazing stunt person, filmed them live action having this incredible lightsaber battle, and then used motion capture to transfer that into animation. I think it's in the top 3 lightsaber battles in all of Star Wars. I mean,
you're absolutely right.
It's incredible.
It breaks your brain because, too, just to say, there are a number of moments in these animated shows that do this where it's real physics that you're looking at, but it's animated, and so you can't make sense of it.
Yeah. And just in terms of her growth as a character, showing that she's no longer a Jedi, there's one great moment where after Order 66 has happened and the clones have taken over and she needs to escape and she's in desperate trouble, she realizes the best way to do this is to free Darth Maul and to kind of set him loose to cause a distraction. And she does this, and he's totally surprised, and is like, well, okay, I'll do what I can. Can I have my lightsaber back? And she says to him, I'm not rooting for you. Which is, it's a brilliant line, but if you think about it, it's so not a Jedi concept. And it's just a wonderful moment of how far she's come from the Jedi. Anyway, I'm doing much too much plot summary. I apologize.
But
I'll move on fast.
I just want to throw in there that there is this, Ahsoka is a really interesting character that exists. And I would say the same with Ezra Bridger from Bad Batch, that exists in the space between, I guess there's a... There's the empathy hubris scale, where Jedi are like the Force is such an allegory for empathy, and being able to wield the Force for good is demonstrating your empathic light, right? Like that you understand the world around you and you can relate to it. And the further one falls from empathy, the further one falls into the trap of hubris. That not only can you see the world, but you can manipulate it. That's where we get to chart Anakin's fall. And I think Ahsoka and Ezra Bridger are these two characters that have mined a place between the two discrete points. And that's the story that I think is so fascinating. And when you talk about it from an ethical perspective, her choices that aren't wholly evil, they aren't wholly motivated from hubris, are manipulating the universe in the mask of those who do.
Yeah, I mean, for those who know D&D, the Jedi are lawful good for the most part. She's not lawful good. She's neutral good or chaotic good,
right?
And occasionally willing to use, and we talked about Ezra, the same thing. Let me just quick finish the Ahsoka stuff, but I think that's such a good point, because I think, to me, that's why I'm so interested in the new Rey movies and the rebuilding the Jedi. But anyway, so we see her do all that, then. And so the question then becomes, okay, so why isn't she fighting in the wars? So I'm going just through her story chronologically. In Rebels, Rebels, by the way, takes place after Revenge of the Sith, during the Imperial period. Rebels starts 5 years before Luke attacks the Death Star and ends kind of like a month before Rogue One. And it really is about the birth of the rebellion, or that portion of the rebellion. It and Andor are very much part of the same story. But in it is revealed that Ahsoka has been hanging out all of this time, and that she... So again, I'm sorry, folks.
There's a lot.
So we don't actually have an explanation for what she was doing during the Galactic... no, I keep confusing myself. I apologize. I might edit this out. I might let you laugh at me. So anyway, during this Imperial period, she's doing all this stuff kind of behind the scenes. We don't really know many of the details. The book Ahsoka gives us a lot more of that story, as does Tales of the Jedi. At some point, she defeats a Sith Inquisitor, who are these people who are trying to hunt down the last of the Jedi. And she takes their lightsabers and remakes them. And for anyone who's interested in Kyber core lore, the Kyber crystal lore, the Kyber crystals are the heart of the lightsaber. Dark side lightsabers are red because they've taken one of those crystals and corrupted it. And often because they've killed a Jedi to do it. And there's some really gruesome ways in which that happens. And then you can rescue those Kyber crystals and turn them back, and thus they become white, which is why Ahsoka's lightsabers are white in this new chapter. So she's for a while kind of a spy and fulcrum. She's helping the new growing rebellion. She eventually reveals herself and is helping the rebellion quite a lot, and is actively going on missions with them. And she finds Rex, who has survived, and it's wonderful. It's some of the best parts of her story are told in Rebels, until we get to this epic confrontation that she has with Darth Vader. And I think this, again, is some of the best Star Wars I've ever seen. She's basically trying to rescue Anakin Skywalker, and in a wonderful collection of dialogue that, again, is to this, she's not really a Jedi anymore. He says, no, I have killed Anakin Skywalker. It's only me. And she says, if Anakin is dead, I will avenge him. Vader says, vengeance is not the Jedi way. She raises her lightsaber, says, I am no Jedi, and charges.
There we go. There we go.
Yeah. What was your take kind of on that scene right there?
Well, first of all, it's lovely to introduce characters that aren't Lucas white hat, black hat, right? That is a reason to cheer for Ahsoka, and it's what makes
Moral
her
greatness,
more than the fact that we have another news story with a principled woman of color and in the center of the live action that is coming for us, which is amazing and it's great, but also it's a great character. It is a great character, and the fact that those two, right? We have to talk about the fact that Ezra Bridger essentially rescues Ahsoka from her own effort to avenge using the tools of the Jedi and manipulating the tools of the Jedi for essentially ill. Right? Like that whole finding that sort of middle place at the Jedi Temple and being able to reach through that back door and pull her out of this fight was an extraordinary beat.
Now, this is something that happens at the end of Rebels 2 seasons later.
Yes.
But yeah, what he's talking about is that the character of Ezra, who we'll talk about in a second, he finds this thing called the World Between Worlds, also known as the most plot devicey of plot devices.
For sure.
Through which he's basically able to pull Ahsoka through time and space out of that battle so that she doesn't die. Because it does look like Vader's going to kill her or that she's going to barely survive. But he basically pulls her out. We don't know exactly when she gets plopped back down, but she clearly avoids all of the... She is not in the universe during the Galactic Civil War between the Rebellion.
She rolled a shortcut, for sure.
Yeah. Which is, again, it's the... This is kind of the struggle I have with any kind of prequel type thing. I'm curious where you are on this. For me, it feels like prequels a lot of the time, but especially Star Wars, like to do you established this thing of there was no others or this was happening or whatever. And then the prequels like to say, how close can we come up to that line while still technically being true? You know, Yoda says there is only one other. He is our last hope. No, there is one other. Actually, there's like 7 others.
Right.
Vader says, when last we met, I was the learner. Now I am the master. Well, actually, there was a couple other times we met where he was technically kind of maybe schooled a little bit.
Look, from a certain point of view, carries a lot of weight in this entire saga.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. But anyways, just to wrap up her story, so we don't know much about what happened. We don't know much about where she comes out. I think this is a lot of what the Ahsoka show is going to go into. And by the way, just the Ahsoka novel, a lot of it is about her being very... It's kind of that A-Team story of her being very jaded, her being like, I don't want to help anyone again. And by the end of it, her deciding she's not going to be a Jedi, but she's going to be a hero. It's a very good novel, definitely worth reading. So all we know then is that in this new version of the story, she has somehow gotten connected with Luke and is helping Luke to somewhat in the training of new Jedi. This is, again, set 10 years after Return of the Jedi in the pre-sequels period. And also that she is hunting for Thrawn. And that she's looking for... basically Thrawn had also disappeared in a plot device and had somehow come back, and we'll get to his story. But yeah, so that's where we are with Ahsoka. What else what are kind of your thoughts on what you're thinking we'll see in the Ahsoka show, or what you don't know about it, or what questions you have?
I don't feel like I can actually broach those questions until we talk about the setup in the final season of The Bad Batch, because so much of the Ahsoka show is essentially season 5 of The Bad Batch, right? Like,
you mean of Rebels?
I mean Rebels. Sorry, goodness, of Rebels, right? Because Ahsoka brings Hera Syndulla and Sabine Wren, and we see the little hologram of Ezra Bridger. We know who has been cast as Ezra Bridger. Like, all of these characters are live action, and of course we have from Star Wars Celebration, we see that Thrawn, the live action version of Thrawn, is here too. So the Bad Batch is Rebels is the setup for Ahsoka. It is like the convergence point. Ahsoka is the convergence point of all of these characters. And I would throw one more in, as I know you're about to go into setup mode again, which is there a connection in Rebels? We see old, clones, right? We get a whole storyline introducing old clones into the mix. In Rogue One, we have this Easter egg of Mark Omega, in the rescuing. So we have this character who is a clone, Omega, not force sensitive, adorable character, wonderful, wonderful character, who and I'm wondering if there is any insight into how that character plays into these other larger stories, knowing how close Ahsoka is to all of these clones.
So I'm not sure what's happening with the character of Omega, who, by the way, is a character who's introduced in the Bad Batch specifically, but certainly Ahsoka's connection with the clones has always been a very important part of her character, and I think will continue. And there's a bit of recent press knowledge that might shed some light on it that I'll talk about in a second, but just to go further on that, as I said, because one of the things throughout military history has always been this struggle of that as a commanding officer, according to most military doctrine, you're supposed to both love your soldiers and care for your soldiers and like be their protector, but also be willing to say like, okay, well, if I send this division forward, they'll get annihilated, but all the other divisions will be able to attack from the other side. And so basically you have to be willing to sacrifice the lives of your soldiers and put them into harm's way and things like that. And in the Pong Krell, we get a wonderful illustration of how that can just go really dark and really bad. That's an arc in the Clone Wars of a Jedi general who goes bad. But the point being that, so I think one of the most brilliant parts of Palpatine's plan is that he realizes that the Jedi empathy will fall apart if they are forced to be military leaders. And so by creating the Clone Wars, he basically puts the Jedi in an untenable situation. And that part of why Anakin becomes so vulnerable is that Anakin cares more for the clone. They all care for the clones, but Anakin will do more to like protect the clones rather than risking them than any of the others. And Ahsoka's somewhat caught in the middle, but Ahsoka does have this wonderful connection with the clones as well, particularly Rex and a couple of the others. Rex being for those who've only seen the movies, remember Commander Cody is the person who works most with Obi-Wan. Rex is the one who is kind of the Commander Cody to Anakin, and his legion, which is the 501st, which if you ever seen the 501st, cosplayers, that's because that's Anakin's legion of clones who become some of the first stormtroopers. So I think, her connection with the clones is very strong. She is very involved in helping some of the last clones who are still around in Rebels. And if there are clones who have survived through the end of the movies, we know their aging process is significantly aged up. So I think that is one reason to be very curious about, will any of the clones have survived to this post-Imperial period of the show? We also know, and again, this is something that just Tamora Morrison has made one or two comments that's done a huge amount of speculation. Tamora Morrison being the live-action actor who played Jango Fett and then now Boba Fett and the clones in general. He has made some comments about being upset that Star Wars hasn't been using him more. A lot of people have run with that to think that means that we're not going to get any of the clones in the Ahsoka show. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. I'm not sure.
That does beg the question to your, that does raise the question, though, to your point, because of the significantly aged up rapid aging process of clones, that they could cast Omega as an adult, and it would be an interesting character. And we've just introduced, as again, spoiler horn, at the end of the Bad Batch season 2, Omega's quote sister. We're introduced to. So anyway, back to you.
And so Omega is a female clone who is she seems to be the way they said Boba Fett was going to have normal aging, not accelerated. She has normal aging as well. So you're right. Yeah, she might be of a normal age.
Yeah.
Excuse me. There's so much great to say about her character. Definitely recommend The Bad Batch, watching it, and our episode by episode coverage of it. But anyway, so yeah, let's quickly talk about Rebels. Actually, why don't we switch this around, both because my throat hurts, but also to give people hear not just my voice. Why don't you give your understanding of kind of like where we are at the end of Rebels?
Okay. where we are at the end of. Holy cow! I'm so in Bad Batch mode now because I've just finished watching it that I need to refresh myself on where we ended with Rebels. So Rebels, the final season of Rebels, we have Thrawn, and this is and I have not read any of the books, but my understanding is this is essentially Thrawn version 2. They have mined the original Thrawn series of books for this character. He comes in as the soft-spoken, sort of gentle admiral who is clearly doing something in his head as he's learning. He studies art, and only when he starts taking the art from, let's say, indigenous peoples and using it as weapons of manipulation and destroying their civilization, do we see that he is really a bad guy. He is a very, very bad guy, and he has taken a special liking to the rebels and Hera Syndulla in particular, and he is studying them very, very hard. So at the end of of Rebels, by the time we get to the end of Rebels, we do have the death of Kanan Jarrus. Kanan Jarrus, who was essentially the Jedi to Ezra.
Yeah. He was a Padawan who, if you remember in the those who've seen the first episode of the Bad Batch TV show, that the thing that splits the Bad Batch is that some of them want to enforce Order 66 and most of them don't. Yes. And it all comes up with this young Padawan who is trying to get away. That Padawan grows up to be Kanan Jarrus.
Yes.
And so Kanan is a former Padawan. He was never really made a Jedi, but he gets made a Jedi through the course of the show. And he's one more of these who has... he's the kind of Jedi he's the kind of Jedi who Mace Windu and Yoda would hate.
Yes.
But, I mean, Ghost Yoda supports him, but I mean, he is for all intents and purposes married. He is deeply in love with Hera Syndulla and deeply attached to her. Him and Hera, who's one of the best pilots the galaxy's ever seen, if not the best, they treat the rest of the crew as their kids. Mm-hmm. He has attachments all over the place, and in one of the final episodes, he sacrifices himself to save their lives.
Yes, and that is a lot of what this last season is all about, because in the end, and we'll just kind of skipping forward, we have these characters that make up Rebels that we just talked about, and at the end of the final episode, we have Ezra and Thrawn on the bridge of one of the Imperial ships, and the space squid whales are tentacularizing.
Plot device number 3, right? The big plot devices we'll be discussing.
I'm so glad we can ride space whales. They actually are grabbing Thrawn, and the space whales also... I can't even... I'm serious. It works so well when you're watching it. But to say it out loud, these space squid whales can go into hyperspace themselves.
Their name is Purrgil.
Yeah, Purrgil. Yeah. Right. So the Purrgils, they can go into hyperspace themselves, and they drag the ship, Ezra and Thrawn, into hyperspace, not to be seen again, as far as we know. They are in the liminal space. So that is another grand sacrifice. Ezra Bridger, everybody thinks he's I guess everybody thinks he's dead. He's gone. There is the mysterious ways of the Force be with him.
So, and let's talk about some of these characters here, because, so first of all, if any of you were watching The Mandalorian, and there was a scene at which your friends who'd watched Rebels went crazy and you didn't understand why, specifically the scene where they're going through hyperspace, and Grogu was watching these, like, shadow of what looked like space whale squid creatures. Yes. Those are the Purrgil. Yes. So that was one of the things that made people go nuts of, like, the Purrgil are in live action. It's amazing. Similarly, when we walk into a bar where Appa, I'm sorry, not Appa from Kim's Convenience, Uncle Iroh, I'm sorry, not Uncle Iroh, Carson Teva, the X-Wing pilot / traffic cop / helping to run secret missions for the New Republic, at the bar that he's hanging out in, one of the people who's at that bar is this large alien-looking blue-furred creature. That is Zeb, who is one of the most beloved members of the crew of the of Star Wars Rebels. So they're doing all these little things to set up that all those characters have lasted this long.
Well, and it was a lovely proof of concept to make sure they could do a Lasat in live action, right? Like that's.
Yeah, I didn't think it would.
I didn't either, and
I
it
was
plays.
Like, oh,
yeah,
it does.
Yeah.
So let's now talk about some of these different characters, and Thrawn is perhaps one of the ones who. I'm just saying, Star Wars fans, especially if you take part in Star Wars discourse online, gird your loins. Because the amount of debate over the character of Thrawn is massive. With a lot of people wanting to see him not as a very, very bad guy, but as a anti-hero.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and so he gets into all these debates of, but does helping the Empire mean that you're by definition a fascist? And well, what about these terrible things he's doing? And what about the things that he is doing? And I think to me, the whole debate assumes that his character is written as a consistent moral character who has the same character, not just like as a person, but in terms of like their character, who they are throughout everything. And I think one of the things we all have to kind of wrestle with is that we basically have 3 different versions of Thrawn. I'm going to quickly sketch them out, and then please ask questions.
Because Thrawn started with the books, right? That's where we start?
Right.
Okay.
So the original set of books, the extended universe that's now referred to as the Legends canon, that Disney came in and said, well, we're not going to use that anymore. There were novelizations of the original movies, but from the first new content was a set of books that came out called the Heir to the Empire series by Timothy Zahn. And it introduced this character of Admiral Thrawn. Thrawn was an alien, and it kind of introduced the idea that if you notice, the Empire is almost entirely human. He was an alien who the Emperor had promoted to the highest rank, which is really weird because he's not human. He's Chiss, which is the name of his race. In those books, he is utterly brilliant. He has the ability to study someone's art, both the individual, like what art they have in their office, but also their art as a culture, and learn a whole bunch about them and use that in battle strategy.
He's a profiler. Now, right?
Yeah, he's a profiler. And I've spoken to anthropologists who focus on the idea of a culture's art, who always agree that like there is a definite kernel of truth that you can learn about a culture by what kind of art they do or don't favor. The lengths to which he takes it are very much like supervillain getting to do a supervillain mental trick that doesn't actually make any sense, but it's really cool, so no one cares. In those books, which are, by the way, as I said, called Heir to the Empire, a phrase you might have heard if you've seen the Ahsoka trailer, very relevant, he is never anything but, I want to bring back the Empire. And he's willing to kill civilians. He's willing to kill other people if needed. He doesn't have a strong moral standpoint. His difference, though, is he does believe that both Vader and the Emperor, I think the best description is if Vader and the Emperor were chaotic evil, he's lawful evil. So, for example, for the most part, he thinks Vader was wrong to go around killing subordinate officers who displeased him. But not because he thinks that morally that's wrong. It's because he thinks, pretty accurately, that's a really bad way to get loyal soldiers to work for you. So he's very different, and he's much more soft-spoken, and he's not Vader, but it's not for any of those reasons. So that's version 1. Version 2 is him in the show, in which I think you described him very well, a very bad guy. Here I think he's even more willing to harm civilians and to do harm and things like that. And once again, his motivations are never really discussed. It's just, I'm supporting the Empire. That's never really questioned. Then you have version 3, which is, there's a thing that sometimes happens in movies or in novels where a writer has created a villain and the writer falls in love with the villain. And so the writer tries to tell you that the villain is actually a really good guy who just made some bad choices. And it sort of makes sense, but you're also like, but wait, you also wrote that he did all these terrible things. In the novels, we go back in time and learn that he is, as I said, from this empire way out in space called the Chiss Ascendancy that's kind of out in unexplored space that the Empire has sort of known about but mostly left on its own. and that empire is facing this other huge galactic threat. And in later books, it's described. Who knows where it's going to go in this? We'll see. But the point being that Thrawn, most of the Chiss Ascendancy thinks they can fight it on their own. Thrawn disagrees. Thrawn thinks the only way they can fight this is by having the rest of the galaxy united against this threat together. And that having a strong authoritarian government and a strong military is the only way to do that. So in his mind, the Empire is very much a necessary evil, and that he doesn't like, that he's very against, but that is required in order to save this existential threat. And some of the things he does in the books, that here we see some of this in the Rebels TV show, is, for example, he's very against the Death Star. Both because of the civilian death involved, but also because he thinks it's a huge waste of resources. But so, and if you remember in the Rebels TV show, he's always pushing this project of the TIE interceptors, which are much better TIE fighters, which we do have by the sequel movies, and which we again saw in Mandalorian. They're the ones that attacked them at the end of Mandalorian season 3. And so in the books, there's this whole thing about how he's trying to cut off resources for the Death Star. He doesn't know about the Death Star originally. He finds out and he hates it. And he's presented, and in the books, he never wants to harm civilians if he doesn't have to. So he's very much a anti-hero who's working for the Empire, but maybe he isn't, or maybe he's working against, and so he's presented as this very morally gray character who a lot of people absolutely love. And I think he's a great character, but I think that's where we get a lot of this debate about, like, well, is he a good character? Is he a fascist because he works in the Empire, etc.? And it's hard because we have different, I think you kind of have to look at each version as its own entity.
Well, it's fascinating to me. I would just say, to insert here, that I drive a carpool, a swim team carpool, and there are some kids in this carpool who are absolute fanatics over Star Wars, and for whom Thrawn is their most favorite and important character in the entire Star Wars universe.
Yep.
That's fascinating, right?
Yeah. Because I think that Timothy Zahn is, I think, a wonderful writer. And I think if you kind of ignored everything else and just read those books, and because then I think it poses a fairly central question.
Yeah.
How much can you compromise and work with one evil thing in order to avoid what you understand is an existential threat to your entire people?
Yeah.
And that's... I like the idea of, if you work for the Empire, you're fascist, you're bad, end of story. But I think that is and I sympathize with that thought, but I think it does not go. I think there's so much more complexity that goes beyond that.
Which is why many of the books actually dive so deeply into perspective setting that we've never gotten in Star Wars in the past. And I think Andor actually does an exemplary job of giving us the workaday perspective of the Empire and how hard it can be because we're all complex organisms.
Yeah. Andor did something brilliant in giving us a girl boss character.
Yeah.
Like, they introduced this woman character who has, men around her who are completely incompetent and who downgrade her all the time because she's a woman. And so there's a party that's like, yeah, you go. Like, I want you to see you succeed at your office job.
Yeah.
Your office job is crushing the rebellion. I don't want to see you succeed. But, and I think at the same time, what Andor did is gave us a character like Luthen. And I find that the way that Luthen and Saw Gerrera are talked about to be utterly fascinating. Because Saw has always been portrayed as our heroes are good because they won't cross certain lines, but Saw Gerrera will.
Yes.
Luthen is presented as a hero, and he is just as morally gray as Saw is, if not more. He throws away 30 rebel lives because it's going to help the overall cause. And I think the thing that makes it so hard to watch Andor is, like, you kind of talked about the original white hats, black hats. Andor points out that when Luke climbs into his X-Wing, he's standing on the shoulders of an awful lot of moral grayness.
Yes.
That is really hard for us to wrestle with.
Well, and you have to ask the question, right? Would the rebellion have gotten off the ground were it not for the moral grayness of Luthen challenging the moral whiteness of Mon Mothma, right? Like, had that challenge not existed, would we have a rebellion? And my argument is no, we would not. Somebody had to be willing to challenge to the point of loss of life because of the scale of what they were attempting to fight.
And that goes all the way through to, I think, Andor is the perfect character for this, and I think I think this level of exploration, Clone Wars and Rebels did some of it, but to me, the moment that it really opens this door is in Rogue One.
Yes.
At the beginning of the movie, when Andor murders in cold blood the person who's helping him, because if he doesn't, he's almost definitely going to get caught, and so literally, Luke doesn't get to blow up the Death Star unless Andor kills that man in cold blood. And like, I think you can then say, well, but there should have been another way he could have done it, blah, blah, blah. But in the trolley, like classic trolley problem, all the people of every other planet after Andor are on one side, or the guy who he kills and those 30 soldiers. And I say that not to say that therefore I think it's clear that he's right. It's that to me, that's what's so good about these stories is that it's hard to know.
Yeah.
I think Thrawn in the books is fascinating. I don't know the kids, and I'm sure it's not your kids in the slightest. I do think that there is a fascination in young men and young boys with the badass, morally gray characters. And sometimes we don't want to see quite the moral grayness. And so when people talk about like Anakin, it was like people who say it was not Anakin's fault at all, or, like the Riddler and the Joker are totally misunderstood. And I think a lot of that attitude sometimes goes into Thrawn did nothing wrong or Thrawn did what he have to do.
Yeah.
But I think I'd be very curious to hear as we see Thrawn what the kids you're hanging out with.
And I'll challenge that assumption. Young boys, young men. We have to remove the gendered conversation there because these are young women who when they cosplay as Sith and Darkseid. Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah.
What a turn a decade makes.
I mean, I think it's like, and there's always been a fascination with evil.
Sure.
Like I think that. Villains are sexier. Villains are a lot more interesting.
Sexy.
Villains, and that is I say that nothing to do with gender.
Yeah.
The villain who's introduced in Clone Wars is a woman named Ventress, who you want to talk about screwing with the sexuality of a whole generation of young people, boys very much included, but not only boys. There's a scene where she stabs someone with her lightsaber, and as he dies, pulls her to him and kisses him.
Yeah.
And it's just like, this is a kid's show?
Not anymore.
There's a lot of 25-year-olds figuring out things they like and remembering that episode.
Yeah, for sure.
But thank you for correcting me on that assumption, because that's definitely very true as well.
So
anything about Thrawn you want to ask about?
Well, the Thrawn. So I feel like I understand the complications of Thrawn and the fact that so much of Thrawn feels like it's been retconned. Do we have any indication of the direction of Thrawn? Are we going to get a V3 Thrawn as an adaptation from Rebels? Are you hearing anything?
This is why I keep mentioning that phrase, heir to the Empire.
Yeah.
Because, first of all, Timothy Zahn has been paid as a consultant, and we don't know exactly in some way. It might be that he was brought in later. But I think one of the concerns that people have had is that Star Wars has treated its authors quite badly. I think it's very true. For example, in Tales of the Jedi, which is a clear ripoff of the story that the author of the Ahsoka novel wrote, she didn't get any credit whatsoever, and she wasn't used as a consultant. Timothy Zahn's been very vocal about that. He's been brought in as a consultant in some way. And so on the one hand, I feel like we are going to get we might get some of that background of him. Mm-hmm. On the flip side, and on the flip side, though, we have two things that are straight out of version 1. First of all, as I said, in the Ahsoka trailer, she says the words, "I'm looking for Thrawn, the heir to the..." She says the word. She describes Thrawn as heir to the Empire, which is the title of those original series of books.
Yeah.
That cannot possibly be a coincidence.
Not a coincidence.
So to me, that tells me we're going to get a lot of his story. And his story involves a Force user that I'll get into in a second. The other thing, though, is that in Mandalorian, in that Shadow Council, one of the people introduced is Captain Pelion. And Captain Pelion is in the original set of novels. We never get anything from the point of view of Thrawn. Thrawn is always treated as kind of othered. Mm-hmm. Pelion is the Imperial captain who was kind of leading things up until the Grand Admiral came. He's Thrawn's second in command. And so we learn all about Thrawn from the Imperial perspective through Pelion. So to me, those are two very big signs that we're going to have a lot of the story of the original books.
Fantastic.
But if we're going to get the original story of the original books, but with some of the other stuff all thrown in, who knows?
Yeah. Okay.
And that gets to, I believe we actually had a question from someone on the True Story Network. Do you want to tell us what that question was?
Yeah, well, I would love to tell you what the question is, but I don't know that I will be able to artfully pronounce the name. This comes from actually fellow Marvel Movie Minute alum Kyle Olson, who is also very excited about the evolution of Star Wars here. What do you think about Joruus C'baoth and when Joruus will show up?
So Joruus C'baoth is, and I get, no one has any idea how to pronounce the name because the name has never been spoken in any Star Wars media that I know of. It's only just been written. It might be in a book on tape or something. Mm-hmm. Joruus was introduced in those Heir to the Empire books. The idea is that he was a Jedi during part of the last parts of the New Republic, the Old Republic time, and that he and a number of others were on a mission called I can't remember the name of it. Outward Bound. I think it's the Outward Bound flight, which was an attempt to basically go rescue far off into the depths of lost space. In the original set of novels, those Jedi were all killed, but somehow some genetic material, probably by the Emperor, but some part of their genetic material was kept, and Joruus C'baoth was cloned. And that one of the first things that Thrawn does is he finds that clone, and he has some great conversations with Pelion about how using the Force is an essential part of what helped the Empire to be so good at battle, but that it should be a tool instead of leading it, because when it's in control, that led to he basically he's like, the Emperor put himself and all of his best leaders onto a half-finished battle station. That was dumb. Mm-hmm. Like, he talks about all these things and that his obsession with Luke Skywalker basically cost the Empire the war, right, which I think is a fairly accurate statement. And so in the books, Thrawn has this power struggle with C'baoth throughout the books, where he's trying to basically use him as a tool without letting him take control. And in the end of the book, some of Thrawn's hubris is that he thinks he can control this guy. He can't, and this guy kind of takes over. And so we do get a great lightsaber battle between Luke Skywalker and this guy shooting Force lightning and all that kind of stuff. That's the original set of books. In the newer set of books, the newer set of Thrawn books, particularly in the Disney canon, the same mission goes out, but what they're doing is going to explore Chiss space, the space that Thrawn and his people are from. Right. And that it is his people and him specifically who destroy that ship. So that opens up all... One of the things I have loved about... One of the things I have loved about a lot of the new series is, frankly, I'm really interested in what happens when Jedi aren't around. Because Jedi and Force users take up so much of the plot that it's kind of dull. But on the other hand, you kind of need someone for Ahsoka to swing a lightsaber at, so there's probably going to be some Force users running around.
Okay.
I think the possibility that since Thrawn and the Chiss were the ones who stopped the outbound flight, that either A, he actually has C'baoth, and C'baoth is going to be there, or B, as we know, as we learned at the end of The Mandalorian, one of the things they've been really wrestling with is how do you clone Force users? So it may well be that the attempt to clone C'baoth is the next evolution of the attempt to clone Force users that we're going to see in Ahsoka, that again is leading up to what I think is the worst mistake that Star Wars has ever made, since we learned that Dooku was secretly working for Palpatine, namely the whole Palpatine coming back. I hate that,
yes,
but it is canon, and so I think we're going to get, if we get C'baoth, I don't know if we will, but if he is, I think it's going to be that him being cloned is one more of this evolution.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but at the end of season 2 of The Bad Batch, they end up in that cloning facility, right? So there's yet another data point that puts these clone characters, in particularly important ones, Omega, in this cloning facility. I feel like you said something, Force users swinging around lightsabers. I can't believe we've talked for an hour and 15 minutes and not once said the words Darksaber, because we do now have non-force wielding users using lightsabers, and not just the Darksaber, right? Sabine purportedly is carrying Ezra Bridger's green lightsaber in the Ahsoka show. So is this an effort to allow us to have cake and thus eat said cake? We have non-force users using the coolest tool in the universe?
I think it's going to be very interesting because, and Mandalorian, I think, did a good job exploring this, and has been explored more in some of the books. But there's always been this question. I think the idea has always been that any person can just turn on the sword. You know, Han Solo used a lightsaber to cut open the Tauntaun to keep Luke warm.
But he never chose to carry it as a mantle. He never chose to keep it.
He never chose to keep it. And in The Mandalorian, again, introduced it because, firstly, just from a physics perspective, like, anyone who's ever, like, tried swinging around a cardboard tube and pretending it's a sword and then actually swung around a sword, the physics are different. The weight is different. And so part of the idea has always been that in order to properly use it, you need the attenuation with the Force to sort of have that, you know, better understanding of where it is in time and space. And also that you have this physical connection with you have the spiritual Force connection with the Kyber crystal that's in it. And some of the novels in the Disney canon, many of which are fantastic, by the way, I think there is some good writing in the extended universe. I do think a lot of it is schlock, forgive me. Certainly, it is almost entirely written by white men, and I do think that
shows.
That shows. Many of whom are white men who don't know if they've met a woman in their lives, because some of the women characters are great, some of the women are written really badly. I love the Darth Bane books, but every woman in there is a femme fatale, and it's really frustrating. But a lot of the newer novels are written by people of color, written by women, or written by queer people, and combinations thereof. And one of the things that's really explored, though, is this idea of, like, why is it that a Force user is the best person to wield a lightsaber? So I think it's been pretty clearly established that a Force user is going to be the best at using a lightsaber, but that, anybody could use it. And what Sabine is doing with it, I think, is a very interesting question that we don't know yet. Whether she's carrying it as a reminder of Ezra, we don't know. And certainly, you know, one thing that's been said a lot is that the Ahsoka show is very much supposed to be a continuation of The Mandalorian and Bad Batch and mostly The Mandalorian and Boba Fett and all these shows. Now, from a filmmaking perspective, can you tell me what is the special thing that there's a little bit of putting you on the spot to know if you've noticed this before? A particular filmmaking technique that happens at the end of 3 movies in Star Wars, namely A New Hope, Force Awakens, and Phantom Menace. So the first of all 3 trilogies.
Something happens at the end of those episodes. Are you talking about? Are you referring to, like, the awards ceremony type thing, or I'm not sure.
It's the very last shot of each one of them.
Oh dear! What is the last shot of A New Hope? How do I not remember this? I've talked about it at length. I don't know what you're talking about.
So in all 3, it pans down to just a circle and then goes black.
Oh, okay. All right. Yep.
At the end of The Mandalorian, season 3, it panned to just that circle on Grogu and then went black.
Interesting.
And apparently one thing that was discussed at Celebration this year was the idea that, so that's always supposed to be, that's the end of part 1 of a trilogy. Yeah. So I think the thinking is Boba Fett, Mandalorian are part 1, Ahsoka and maybe one or two other things are going to be part 2, and then the movie that Filoni is making will be part 3,
the finale.
So all this is clearly tied together, and part of why I bring this up is a big part of Sabine, who is the character she's a Mandalorian. She has a very deep history with Mandalore, and she's the one who quite literally gives Bo-Katan the Darksaber that starts all the stuff on in The Mandalorian.
Well, and we should say the Darksaber is an avatar of leadership for Mandalore, who he or she who wields the Darksaber won it in battle and therefore is the one who should be followed as the leader of the Mandalorian peoples.
And kind of, I think, the brilliant plot line of Mandalorian Season 3 is Bo-Katan starting thinking she only is a leader if she wins it in battle. And by the end, she's proven herself to be a leader without it, and thus she's given it as a sign of leadership.
Well, and part of the lore of the Darksaber, too, though, when we talk about the attenuation with the Force in order to wield it, was that the Darksaber for he or she who has not earned it is heavy. Right? There's a whole great sequence where Din Djarin is actually trying to fight with it, and he cannot because the thing weighs too much.
Yeah. And I think part of that is supposed to be, it's that attenuation to the kyber crystals. And so there are some who argue that it's just about being a better fighter. There's some who argue that it's about being pure of heart. There's some who argue that the Force becomes the most hand-wavy mystical thing you've ever had, that even though none of them are Force users, that the kyber crystal attunes itself to the person who deserves it. Who knows?
Whatever, hand wavy.
We discussed quite a lot of the hammer and he whoever who shall wield the hammer, etc. I will just point out, though, that so the whole point of the Darksaber, it was created by a Jedi, the only Mandalore who's been a Jedi, but then it became the symbol of leadership, and it was this example of a Mandalore, a Mandalorian who could use the Darksaber. Again, created by a Force-using Mandalorian.
Right.
We now have another Force-using Mandalorian.
In Grogu. Right.
Grogu, at some point, if he were a Jedi, would have to find and create his lightsaber. The kyber crystals inside that thing probably are still good, or at least are savable.
Sure.
I think I don't know if we're going to get this, but I think there's a universe in which Darksaber 2.0 is recreated and Grogu wields it.
And using Grogu as a unit of measurement, that Darksaber is like 3.5 Grogus, and so it would have to be shortened.
It would have to be shortened, but certainly we know that
smaller sabers exist. Yoda had a smaller saber. Yeah.
Yoda has a smaller saber. Ahsoka has if any of you have seen the fighting style where you have kind of like a dagger for blocking, or a short sword for blocking, and a long sword for attacking.
That's Ahsoka.
Ahsoka has a shorter lightsaber and a longer lightsaber. So certainly possible.
Okay, I know we're getting slightly long in the tooth, but I have one more question for you about how things interact. And I know that the timelines are a little bit off, but I'm curious your take on the current slate of games, because we're as we record this, we're on effectively the eve of the release of the next Jedi,
the sequel to
Jedi Fallen Order, and the cinematic trailer for the Old Republic has dropped, and I'm curious your take on how the games interact with around outside of universe.
So they have made clear that these newer games are part of the canon. And so, for example, Jedi Fallen Order is about yet another Jedi, a Padawan who survived
Order 66.
And to the great frustration of many, but also the great love of many, there's a number of the planets that they visit in Bad Batch Season 1 are also planets that are visited in the video.
Dathomir. Big one.
Dathomir, yeah. Dathomir is a big one, and Dathomir comes from the Clone Wars, because that's the homeworld of the Night Sisters, who I would love to see live action.
So much.
And you want to talk about the young girls going crazy over Sith?
Yeah, right.
Dark Side. Well, what I love most about the and people of all genders to be sure, but the cosplay, if nothing else, one thing I love about the Dark Sisters, the Night Sisters, they are dark side users who are not Sith.
Right.
And that's something I really want to see explored a lot more in the Rey movies, is what happens when we get outside of the Jedi Sith binary and get to talk about like other because to some extent I think like and this is a bit of a tangent, forgive me, but I think this is kind of what we're talking about with Kanan, with Ezra, with Cal, the main character, or Cal, I think it is the main character of Jedi Fallen Order, is, and even with Rey, you have Jedi who have attachments. You have good side Force users who are able to, it's kind of like okay, if the sin is, sexual impropriety, some people will say, so therefore you should never even like be alone in a room with someone of the opposite gender or whatever. Right. The Jedi of the time of the Fall of the Republic are that like super, super, super strict. The High Republic books have been telling us that there used to be Jedi who were basically F-boys for all intents and purposes, who would like, yeah, I can have no strings attached sex. I just can't like connect with someone.
Right.
And that gets them into trouble too. But the point being that the strictness to the doctrine and the rigidness of it that we have by the time of Yoda and Mace Windu has not been true for all of Star Wars. And so it's very possible that we're going to get more of that. We're going to explore more of that in the Rey movies and going forward.
Which I think is so fantastic, right? We have only experienced a slice of time where we didn't even, it's like a fish swimming in water doesn't know that it's surrounded by water. We've been watching Jedi and Sith from the perspective of Dogma, not knowing that Dogma didn't exist at one point around these
or it was different. Or it was
like different.
Any religion.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that's why the High Republic books are so good. Strongly recommend them. The Acolyte TV show is going to be based on the High Republic books. We didn't even get to that. We'll do that in another episode coming up. But I think all that's going to be super relevant. But to answer your question, I will first just say that I, as someone who doesn't play many video games, Jedi Fallen Order, if you enjoy complicated hand-eye coordination platform-type video games, is apparently very good.
I will confirm that. I played the whole thing, and I loved it.
Okay.
And I would say it gave me great hope that they brought Cameron Monaghan, the actor who plays Cal Kestis, at the celebration in London this year. Like, he had a whole thing. He gave away his schmuck. It was awesome. So
yeah, my only frustration, I am not as good at video games. I'm not as good at hand-eye coordination. So my frustration that I had to be good at hand-eye coordination to learn a Jedi story was very frustrating to me.
Get it.
And I had to I had to be like, here, please play this the game for me.
Right.
But the point being, yes, I think that those games, and the connection I was going to make, not only Dathomir, but in that he also goes to kind of like a planet where everything is being scrapped. And that planet is also where they go at the end of Bad Batch to get the chip out of Wrecker.
Yes.
And so there's a big connection. Yeah, I think those games are very much going to be canon. I think in the game that I think there are a couple Battle Squadron games where we learn more about what happened to the Imperial troops immediately after the death of the Emperor and the Battle of Endor, because a lot of them didn't surrender. They kept fighting. And through that game, and also a game called Squadrons, which if you enjoyed, like if of our age, if you ever played X-Wing or TIE Fighter as a kid, or you just enjoy any kind of like flight simulator type game, Squadrons is a great game for that. You get to fly any ship you want, either side.
It's wonderful. And my understanding, I haven't played it this way, but my understanding is that it does work with PlayStation VR too, so you can actually be in the cockpit.
That's awesome.
Which seems fantastic.
But the point being that in those games, we get introduced to a number of characters who have been significant. One of which, who's then been further introduced in the books, is a character named, I think it's Admiral Sloane. And I think her name is also, I don't think it's Rey, maybe Rex. I don't remember exactly what her first name is. But she's a woman of color, and she is one of the main, like, of this struggle for power. She's the one who leads one of the biggest factions of Imperial power immediately after the fall of Endor. She's one of the people who's involved with the whole struggle for power that we saw in the Shadow Council, and she's eventually one of the people who will win that struggle for power, and probably thus defeat Thrawn, or emerge even more after Thrawn is defeated in whatever way is going to happen. And she is the one who is she is one of the ones who helps found the First Order.
Okay.
And so she and a lot of her stories was first introduced in some of those video games. So yeah, I think they are they're doing something very ambitious. You know, like the MCU and DC and some of the others have always said, we're inspired by the stuff on the page, but we are a complete universe. You don't have to watch anything that's not on screen to fully understand this. Mm-hmm. I think Star Wars is doing something really brilliant in that they're trying to say all the stuff on page and even on video game is canonical, but you can watch just the stuff and still get it. And Ashley Kaufman, who's my co-host for a lot of the coverage, including all the coverage we did of Mandalorian, she hasn't seen any of the animated stuff. She hasn't played the video game. She hasn't read the books. And I loved getting her perspective because she was still able to enjoy every bit of Mandalorian. So I think so far, Star Wars is kind of doing a master class of you can just watch the high-profile stuff and enjoy it, but if you've read the books, if you've watched the old shows, if you've played the video games, you'll catch all these Easter eggs.
It's possible to be a completionist.
Yeah. How well they're going to hold that balance into the future, I don't know.
Because of all the shoehorning, right? We've already talked about it. Like they're bending the will of our, acceptance of verisimilitude, right? Like there's only so much I can handle.
Because like I said, there's so many plots that I want them to focus on, and they only have 8 episodes. But to give us a story about Sabine and not have her comment on the fact that like she was very involved in the fall of Mandalore, and now Mandalore has been fixed, and like how are we not going to have an episode where she and Bo-Katan hang out for an episode, or she goes back to Mandalore?
For sure.
I don't know. Yeah. I'm very excited about it. I have a lot of consternation, but I think there's a lot of great storytelling still to come.
Well, I love it. I'm an enthusiastic supporter, and there were some dark times for my own Republic where I was not as looking forward to some of these things. But I think what's the most fascinating thing that as I look inside myself, what is it that keeps me interested and has brought me back into so much Star Wars lore and interested in the small screen? It's the animated properties. Right? They have been so much fun. They make me feel like a kid again. And what possibly could be better than that?
Yeah. I think they've really done incredible things. And I like I said, the fact that they got Zeb right tells me that I have... Because one of my first thoughts is, why don't you just keep it all animated? Because it's so hard to do live action. I also think animation gives you a thing of... one of the complaints I think people have is like, well, if this show is called The Mandalorian, why do we spend so much time with Bo-Katan? If this show is called Boba Fett, why do we spend so much time with The Mandalorian? With Ahsoka, like I said, you might have an episode that just Sabine goes back to Mandalore. In animation, because you're using all voice actors and it's much less of their time, it's much easier to have... Like, the Clone Wars and Rebels were ensemble shows in a way that I think is hard to do when you have big-profile actors. But I hope they can pull it off because I think that there's really some great stuff out there.
For sure.
So we'll see. Are you going to play the new video game?
It's pre-ordered.
Okay.
Absolutely. Well, it's going to automatically download.
I think I know what episode you're signed up for next. Because then if you actually play it all out, and I might, Riki Hayashi, another one of our regular guests, he might play it all out as well. I don't know what his availability is, but I might get one or both of you on, and I'll just watch the cutscenes on YouTube.
Okay.
And we can just do it that way. So... All right. Well, Pete, thank you so much for being a guest on this. As I said, this is part of... I have loved everything I've done with Stranded Panda Network. I'm staying friends with all the people in Stranded Panda. They're great podcasts. Please check them out. But these podcasts that I run, this and Superhero Ethics, have moved over to True Story. We're still in the technical process of making it all happen, but I'm going to be working a lot with Pete and with Andy and with Kyle and with a lot of the other great people over there. So why don't you come on, Pete, and tell us more about what is True Story and how people can find it, and what are the things they'll find there?
Well, True Story, you can find us at True Story FM. Technically, it's TRUSTORY, no E, but if you type True Story with an E, it'll get there too.
And it's .fm, not TrueStoryFM.com.
Right, TrueStory.fm. And, we do a mix of shows. Many of our shows are shows that we produce for our business clients, and we help them tell their stories in their own wonderful ways. And so, you'll see as you look through True Story, their top half of shows are all content shows related to the work that we do with our clients. And then we do a whole lot of shows around, entertainment. As you keep scrolling, we've got the Cool Time Dice Hour. We've got a role-playing game, the bunch of movie shows. We've got a show that is entirely dedicated to drinking game with the TV show Supernatural. Festival. We've got just a lot of stuff going on. In fact, of interest, perhaps, if you're a movie lover, Andy and I just interviewed the complicated character that is Dr. Uwe Boll, who is known for directing a lot of video game adaptations and is widely regarded as one of the worst directors of all time. And he came on a show that we do called Movies We Like to talk about his love for the film There Will Be Blood. And I assure you, he is a more complicated student of cinema than you would expect. So those are the kinds of shows that we do, and we love doing them, and we love just making podcasts. So thrilled and honored to have you join the family, and eager to see what happens next.
Yeah, there's so much good stuff to check out there. If you follow my stuff, you may have heard me on the Marvel Movie Minute. All their stuff is great. They've been doing episode by episode, minute by minute coverage of Avengers, which I'm scheduled to get on and talk about at some point soon. But so many other great people have gone on there. The Next Real podcast. Every now and then they put out a request for hey, what are more things we should comment? I am now 3 for 3 of suggesting films they should watch, only to have Andy do his best to not sigh in exasperation as he says, Matthew, if you listen to all of our old episodes, you'd find we already did that.
The expectation that you've listened to all of our old episodes is it is unfair because that show has as many episodes as it does. It's absolutely understandable. But
one thing I recently found out is because I recently did the art school nerd thing of I watched Seven Samurai and then immediately watched Magnificent Seven, and suggested that as a back-to-back. In fact, you guys actually did a whole series on the Seven Samurai school of films.
There are a lot.
Seven Samurai had a very big influence on a lot of things, so I'm looking forward to listening to those episodes. I'll also say, am I correct? I've also been a guest on the Totally Awesome 80s podcast, which has also joined the family recently.
It has. Chrissy Lenz is our dear friend of the network, and Chrissy has both the Most Excellent 80s Movies podcast and Gank That Drank, and that's the supernatural drinking game podcast. Most Excellent 80s Movies podcast she does with the filmmaker Nathan Blackwell, and they're fantastic. They talk about their favorite 80s movies, just 80s movies, through the lens of how well do these things hold up, and are they still great movies? Or let me assure you, Teen Wolf is not. So those are the kinds of things that they talk about. Really, really fun.
I got to go on there and talk about Risky Business and how, as a 16-year-old, I watched Risky Business and was like, this is so cool. Yeah. Tom Cruise is living this cool, awesome life. And then watching it as a 40-year-old, I was like, oh, this is a dark commentary on all the things. The fact that I enjoyed this as a 16-year-old, this movie is actually talking about all the reasons that that's toxic and wrong and bad. Yes. And it really holds up, and it's really good.
Yeah.
In a way that a movie that gave us Tom Cruise dancing in his underwear in a very enjoyable scene, you don't expect it actually has that much depth to it, but it really does.
For sure. And did wonders for Joe Cocker, I think, too, at the time.
Yes.
Right? Old time rock and roll.
Very much so. Well, Pete, thank you so much for being a part of this. And definitely, folks, check out all the stories that are happening over on True Story FM. Obviously, for myself, I am The Ethical Panda. If you go to theethicalpanda.com, you'll find all of my podcasts. Apparently, you can also go to, I think by the time this is announced, you can also go to True Story FM and then click on something indicating me. You'll find all my podcasts. Most importantly, though, you can find all the ways to contact us. Love listener feedback. Jenny Huang, you wrote a beautiful email that I keep not getting a chance to mention, which I very much apologize for. We're definitely going to do a feedback episode soon. We've got a couple other great feedback as well. But let us know what you think. What are the parts of the story you're excited for? What did we not touch on that you want us to touch on? You can find me on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, email directly, all the things. Would love to hear your feedback. So on behalf of myself, Pete Wright, thank you all so much. We have spoken.
Fantastic.
All right. And now for our patrons who stuck around, Pete has to go pretty soon. We had some fun at the beginning of this episode, so most of you are going to get a little bit of a blooper outtake reel. But just as one last thing I wanted to ask in our segment, Pete, what is, if you because you also are a student of filmmaking, I think you've done some filmmaking yourself. Mm-hmm. If you could make a Star Wars movie or TV show, what's the era of the story? Who are the characters? What's the story you would want to tell?
Well, it's a little bit of a cheat because I feel like they hit it with The Mandalorian season 1, right? This is a frontier thing that takes me as far away from Skywalkers and Coruscant as you could possibly go. Like for me, the ideal Star Wars story is set in that period, that era, and is also Breaking Bad. Like, you know what? It's like two totally unrelated people trying to do something that also tells a complex story of moral grayness, and so that's for me. Those are the tones and textures that really light me up from the perspective of film. I am all about shiny, flashy, hovery things too. Like in terms of the raw dopamine hit, but for the story, that opening sequence of Mandalorian season 1, episode 1, walking into the bar and getting in a fight is that's terra firma for me.
It was when he used a door to chop someone in half, and my subtitles were on, and the subtitles said "thud" as a part of his body hit the floor. And it's so funny because you just said what you love is the animation that makes you feel like a kid.
Isn't that funny?
Like, I want that, but you're right. It is, and the fact that they did Andor so well tells me that we can do all of it. And I think that's the thing that I'm kind of. In the same way that with the MCU, we've now gotten, like, Ant-Man was a heist movie within the MCU. And other things, like, I am not a horror fan. And so Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness is not my favorite movie. But I love that Ashley Coffin is a huge horror fan, and she loves it because it's horror in the MCU.
Yeah.
I would love to see them do a horror. I would just love to see different genres. Like, I think you're right. The Breaking Bad type stuff. Give us more of a heist movie again. Rogue One is kind of that, but give us like a straight up heist movie. Give us a horror movie.
I think that to that end, like we talked about my appreciation of the Favreau-Filoni era. And I can't say that authentically without adding the trust that they put into Tony Gilroy and team is not should not be under-exaggerated because they let him do what he wanted to do. And he is a writer's writer of these kinds of stories to give us this sort of intrigue spy story that appeals to so many people beyond Star Wars, right? How many times have you heard that? People saying, oh, you're not a Star Wars fan. Doesn't matter. Watch Andor. You won't even need to know that it's Star Wars to know that it's just a great show. And I think that's really important. I'm also a huge fan of Rogue One, and that's the kind of prequel that I love. I know how it's going to end, but they made me feel something along the way, and they did it in a sort of grit and texture that really appealed to me. As much as I like the frontier, like dark and dirty stuff, their final fly into Boca Raton at the end, which everything is so bright and blue, and it just looks so good with the palm trees. That's like a cool environment that Star Wars doesn't normally take me. So,
well, and it's interesting you saw it that way because I saw it as Vietnam.
Oh, that's fair.
Like all the the little islands and patties, to me, and the fact that they come in these their spaceships, but the way that the people jump out of the sides, it looks like those huge helicopters.
You're absolutely right. Yeah.
From Vietnam War movies.
Yep.
So the two things that I will say that I would love to see, and these are also kind of book recommendations for you and the kids you deal with. First of all, in terms of, I think any person can love these, but especially for young adults. Have you heard of the Queen's Peril, Queen's Shadow, Queen's Hope trilogy? It is a series of books written by E.K. Johnson, and they are about Padme and her handmaidens.
Oh.
And it is the most this is the best way I can say it is the idiot male fanboys who hate, anti-misogynistic would describe them as girl power books, and they're the best of that genre I could possibly imagine.
Okay.
Because a big part of what they're about, first of all, it just gives so much more interiority to Padme and her story. But also a lot of it's about how the way they use their makeup and the fashion and the way they portray themselves to be spies and to be ignored. And so I'd love to see those books. I think Padme's character really got given short service. I'm dying of sadness, like I'm an 18th century English novel character. So the Queen, they're fantastic. I'd recommend them to anyone, but especially young adults, teenagers who want to have more strong women characters in Star Wars.
Yeah.
And the other one is, if you like star-crossed lovers stories, but not in the rom-com way, in the Romeo and Juliet kind of way, the book Fallen Star. It's about two young people who grow up on a planet that the Empire brings order to, and so both of them join the Imperial Navy as TIE fighter pilots, because they think, what else should you do? And through their eyes, we come to see all the terrible things that are happening in the galaxy, and one of them joins the rebellion, and one of them doesn't, and it's just... You get to sit with Imperial pilots who've learned that Alderaan has been destroyed. Mm-hmm. And some of them are like, how could we do this? And others are like, well, but no, this means no other planets have to be destroyed. It's justified. If you love moral grayness, it's a phenomenal book.
I haven't read many in Star Wars books, but there was one that I did read, and I can't remember what it was called, but it was a story of these two lovers, and one of them was on the Death Star when it was destroyed. Does that ring a bell? Oh, I might have to find it, but it was lovely.
I think I don't remember exactly what that one was, but there is a major character in the Fallen Star, who was on the Death Star when it was destroyed, but not one of the two lovers.
Okay.
So,
well,
anyway,
this has been a treat.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Matthew.
You got to go. We have spoken. Thanks to all the Patreons. Bye-bye.